Hello everyone and welcome back to the Psyched YouTube channel. Today I'm talking with my friend Michael about the reward network in the brain. Particularly why we like to get rewards, which brain processes reflect getting a reward or a punishment, how dopamine is associated with getting a reward, and how this all relates to addiction. So I hope you will have fun with our conversation.
The dopamine, right? Because dopamine is kind of related to reward, right?
Yes. So now you want to get serious. I see. Let's talk about the science behind it. You mentioned dopamine. Dopamine is what people typically assume is related to rewards. There are a lot of channels on YouTube, fitness channels, but also other channels that every time they talk about something positive happening, they talk about reward in your brain and the reward chemicals in your brain getting released and everything. And that's true. I mean, it's true that dopamine is related to reward. That's absolutely correct. However, it's just a very, very small part of the entire story, and there's a lot more to unpack there. And that's kind of what I want to do today. I mean, by itself, dopamine is already like incredibly complex. Dopamine is also related, for example, to movement. If you know a person who has Parkinson's disease is a disease that primarily affects dopamine, the dopamine in the brain. So, you know, it's more than just a chemical in the brain that makes you happy. It's way more than that. It's incredibly complex, and even that is just a tiny bit of the story.
Right, exactly. If I'm not mistaken, I think dopamine, when it comes to Parkinson's, is a disruption in the substantia nigra, I think, the part of the brain.
Right.
If I'm correct.
Just throw your knowledge there, man.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of your episode, right? Because this is your PhD topic, kind of, right? So I kind of want to show off my skills.
It is, yeah. Yeah, so the substantia nigra, just to clarify this, is a part in the brain that's very dopamine heavy, but it is more related to movement. It is also somehow related to reward, but it's also related to movement. It's a tiny area in the brain, somewhere in the middle of the brain, but we won't be talking too much about that. But yeah, you're right. So this was my PhD topic. So I studied this for 4.5 years, wrote my dissertation about it. I have published 10 or so papers on this topic, maybe even more. I spent a great deal of my life studying this.
Yeah. So I mean, just to kind of make it clear for the listeners and viewers, I mean, I guess this episode is going to be you talking about this topic, the topic that you're an expert in. Now kind of sit back and listen and learn, and hopefully ask some insightful questions along the way. And yeah, so why don't you start? So tell them about exactly what we're going to discuss today.
Yeah, so let's talk a bit about how rewards are processed in the brain. So one thing, what would be a good start to know is that the brain actually is kind of like a predictive system. So when we perform an action, then the brain makes a prediction of what the outcome could be, and that is something which we call predictive coding. This is known for quite a while, and there are some examples that I will give in a minute, but that is a very basic underlying story that you will see through the processing of rewards and also of punishments and a lot of other things in the brain. So, for example, the predictive coding, this theory about predictive coding, it came about by another theory which is called afferent copying. So what's afferent copying? Afferent copying is so afferent means to send out a signal. So when you send out a signal, there is a copy is made. So what are we talking about? For example, when you are making a movement with your hand, let's say your left hand, you're moving your left hand, then the motor cortex, so the area in the brain that is important for creating the movement, sends a signal towards the muscle to actually move that hand. However, a copy of that signal is made and is also sent to the somatosensory cortex. The somatosensory cortex is the cortex that, or the part of the brain that is important for feeling and so for sensory information of feeling. So when you with your left hand and move towards something wood, and you would feel it, and you would feel it's wood. So why is that important? That is important because in such a way the body can predict what a potential outcome will be. So that sounds very similar to what's going on in the reward system. That's also the reason why you cannot tickle yourself. So if you, with your left hand, make the motor command to tickle your right hand, you won't be, you can tickle your right hand, but you won't feel it as tickling. Why not? Because that afference copy, so that copy of the motor command, is also sent to the sensory cortex of the right hand. And then the right hand will know, okay, so I will be tickled, so I don't have to feel that tickling sensation. So basically it suppresses that. So that's what an afference copy is. And basically it shows that the brain already makes a prediction of the outcome, in this case about what the movement will be.
Yeah, and maybe this is a bit of a sidetrack, but we spoke a little bit about afference copying before we recorded this podcast. You told me something really interesting about the role of afference copying in reading, when we read silently to ourselves. Can you say that again for listeners?
Right. Yes, that's right. So the example of what I gave with tickling is one example, but another example is when we're speaking. Speaking is, of course, also a motor command in some sense, right? Of course, you have to generate the words, and then you have to output the words, which means you have to move your mouth, you have to move your tongue. So that's a motor command. And there is an afference copy made to, again, the sensory area, in this case, the auditory sensory area, which is the area in the brain that is important for listening or hearing. So when you speak, that signal that is created to create speech is also sent to the auditory cortex, so that the auditory cortex can predict what it will be hearing. That's the reason why you don't hear yourself very well. So for example, when you record yourself for the first time, you will note that your voice is completely different from what you expected. And that's because you hear yourself different than other people hear you. And the reason for that is that your the hearing of your own voice is suppressed by the auditory cortex, because you already have a copy of what you were actually going to say sent there by the motor command of the actual speech. So that means that, for example, when you are reading, you can read silently, which is basically creating a motor command that is so small that it doesn't actually create a sound, but still that motor command is there and it's sent to the auditory cortex. So basically you can read out loud in silence to yourself. That's kind of what speaking to yourself is. And you will note that some people are not as good at this as others. So some people, when they read silently, they will still move their lips a little bit, which is just that motor command that is then also sent to the auditory cortex.
Right, yeah. I was kind of almost mind blown when I heard it for the first time, but it makes perfect sense, Yeah. But you spoke a bit about predictive coding before. And I'm wondering so what's going on in the brain? Can we measure it with some technique like EEG or something?
Yeah, right. So let me first come back to a little bit the reward story. So so these were examples about more movement related stuff, movement of your hand or movement of your mouth, creating speech. But when we are making an action that can lead either to a reward or a punishment, then we also have this predictive signal of what the future potential outcome will be. So for example, if you buy a candy bar, you will have the expectation that that candy bar will taste nice, right? Because that's kind of what you, that's why you would buy a candy bar, because you want it to taste nice. So
Right.
you kind of have an expectation that the candy bar will taste nice, and that prediction is made in the brain. And then later on, when you eat the candy bar, you will compare the actual outcome, so how it actually tasted, to what your prediction of that was. And that's kind of what predictive coding is in relation to rewards and punishments. And typically those signals will be so typically what we do is we predict rewards. So we tend, like as humans, we tend to predict the positive things about it. We tend to predict positive outcomes. That's not necessarily always true. For example, when you are studying for a test, you will know, or you will probably predict that the studying for the test itself, like the studying itself, will be a little bit boring or a little bit, will not be as rewarding. That will be more kind of a punishment. The reward comes then later when you actually do the test and you have a nice score. But so a prediction doesn't need to always be about a positive thing, but it tends to be more often than not. So, for example, when you buy the candy bar, you will predict that will give you a positive outcome, because why else would you do that outcome? We always try to seek the positive things. Yeah. So and yeah, you asked about can we measure this? And actually we can. So there is a technique in neuroscience called electroencephalography, which in short is EEG, and I will refer to it as EEG, which measures signals in the brain, and maybe some of the listeners have seen that before, where you have those wavy patterns. Sometimes you can see it on TV or in some other series, but so those wavy things, they are actually brain signals. What they are is they are the differences in potentials from a group of neurons. And when I'm saying a group of neurons, or a group of brain cells, I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of neurons, right? So if there are hundreds of thousands of neurons active at the same time, this will create this waveform. And that EEG signal, so that those waveforms, you can relate to a certain point in time. So, for example, we will only look at those brain waves when we are actually getting a reward. So let's have people do a task where they have to press a button when they see a circle, and they have to press another button when they see a square, and when they press a circle, they get a reward. For example, they win 50 points and they have to have a high score at the end. When they get to 50 points, that's when we actually can measure the EEG. So we basically time lock our EEG recording to that reward. And then we can look at the brainwaves that are particularly necessary for that processing of the reward. And that's what we call event-related potentials. So for event, from there is an event, there's something going on. In this case, you get a reward or a punishment. And it's event related, so it's related to that event, and it's a potential. And a potential is just a word for a difference in signal, which I mentioned as a brainwave. So when you're looking at when people get a reward, there are 4 signals that we can identify reliably when people do those tasks. And you will see this in every participant. You can run hundreds of studies, and hundreds of studies will find this. So this is a very reliable signal. This is a signal we find in everybody. This is, there are a lot of things about the brain we don't know, but this is stuff we do know.
Yeah, that's really cool, I think. The fact that you have this consistency across time, but also between people, that we all, regardless of who we are and when we do this, when we see a reward, for example, we will see this event-related potential, or ERP, as you call it. It's pretty interesting stuff.
Right. So I guess what I can do is I can talk a little bit more in detail about those four signals. So why are these four signals interesting? Because they actually relate to different steps in this predictive coding. And I will give some examples about that, and then you will see what the brain is actually doing when you're getting a reward. However, before we go there, of course, there's some stuff going on before that, right? So it's when you get a reward, you first have to process the sensory information. Sensory information is just the things you see, hear, feel, and so on. So when you're eating a candy bar, you first have to, of course, taste the candy bar before you can know whether that taste is any good or bad. The same when we in more neuroscientific research settings would let people do a task and they get points for a certain outcome. They first have to see the points before they actually can know whether that's a reward. So what happens first in that example is that let's say people press the circle button and they get 50 points. The number 50 that's on the screen is first going to your eyes, and that signal from the eyes is going to the visual cortex where the number 50 is processed. So first it will the number 5 is created, the number 0 is created, and then you know that you saw a 5 and a 0, and a 5 and a 0 together is 50, and you know that 50 is a numerical value. And that's basically what happens in the first few 100 to 150 milliseconds. That's just a sensory processing, just to see what you actually see. And then the signal is going to the frontal cortex where the actual reward and punishment processing is going on. So I'm not saying that this is not important for reward and punishment processing, but it's not directly related to this processing. This is just something that needs to happen.
Right, yeah. So you're basically saying that first there's a sensory processing of the reward. Like we see when we're doing a neuroscience task, we first see on the screen that we have some points coming. There's a reward, and that is a prerequisite for us to be able to experience that this is a reward, and that's a separate process in the brain, right? Or
exactly, yeah. And of course, when you would eat a candy bar, it's the same thing, but then you first have to sense what the taste is going onto your tongue, and then the brain processes this as, okay, this is a sweet taste, and maybe also some other taste as well. And then after you identify the taste, that's when you can judge whether this is a reward or a punishment, right?
Right.
So okay. But yeah, so these are just things that happen beforehand, and these will happen all the time in the brain. And when you look around, visual information is processed all the time, and I'm pretty sure we will be talking about this in a future podcast as well. But let's move on to the actual reward and punishment processing. So I talked about those signals, those event-related potentials in the brain, which you can measure with EEG, so electroencephalography. And as I said, there are 4 components that relate to different things in this predictive coding. So let's talk about those. So the first one that you will see is called the P200 or the P2 component. And those names refer just to when they happen and how they look like. So as I told you, those EEG signals are kind of like waves, and a wave has a positive peak and a negative peak. And the P just stands for positive or negative. Why are they positive and why are they negative? It just happens to be the case. Like that's just how we measure it. If we, you can actually reverse the sensors on the head with EEG, and then you would that positive peak would change into a negative peak. But typically, when you measure it like we standardly do, you will see a positive peak. And the 2 stands for 2 because it's the second positive peak. So what about the first positive peak? That first positive peak is the one that happens during the sensory information processing. So the stuff that happened before when you saw the numbers or tasted the taste.
right.
So it's called P2 or sometimes P200. And the 200 stands for it happens after 200 milliseconds. However, nowadays researchers tend to not use that number anymore that much, or that higher number anymore that much, because although it happens around 200 milliseconds after you get the reward, that can vary quite a bit. So in some participants, it's 150, in others, it's 250. And also it depends very strongly on the task. Sometimes if a task is really complex, then it takes the brain a little bit longer to process this. So typically people refer to P2, the second positive component. So how does that look like? You will just see those 4 waves, and the first wave you will see when looking at that area is a positive peak, and that's called the P2. And that is related to the processing of rewards and punishments. So actually that will tell you whether something is positive or negative. And it also has an element of subjectivity in there. So that first positive wave will be bigger when you get a reward compared to when you get a punishment. So when you get 50 points, that peak will be bigger than when you get minus 50 points. But there's also a subjective element in there. And it seems to be the case that first positive peak can also be different if you get a subjective reward versus an objective reward. For example, what do I mean with that? So let's say it's Christmas and you get a present that is worth about $100. Then that's of course a reward, right? You gain something that you didn't have before, and $100 is quite a bit. So that will be a reward. That's objectively a reward. You're better off after than before. However, if everybody else in the family gets a present that is worth $500, then you will still feel like you're being punished, right? Because everybody else did get something better than you got. So subjectively, that will not feel as a reward. So whereas objectively it's a reward, subjectively it's probably more a punishment. And that is what you will see in this first positive peak. So this first positive peak, the P2, really reflects on how you interpret that reward, whether it's good or bad. So basically that first signal is kind of like it's whether it's good or bad.
Yeah, wow. So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're basically saying that when it comes to reward, behaviorally speaking, of course, it's not only the objectivity of how much the reward is worth, right? But we also have a subjective perception of the reward. You know, if I get a certain amount of money, but everyone else gets 10 times that amount of money, I'm going to feel bad, right? It's not going to feel like a reward. And this subjective experience is reflected by this P2 event-related potential that you described, right?
Right. So the P2 actually reflects both the objective and the subjective part, because both of them are important in a sense, right? So even in this example of Christmas, if you get $100 or a present worth of $100, that eventually is still a reward, even though it feels unfair and it subjectively feels bad. It's still a reward, and in a survival sense, those will still be a good thing, right? So going back to our ancestors, when you had to survive and you get a reward, even if that reward is crap compared to all the other rewards that you could have gotten, it's still a reward. So it's still promoting survival. So they're both important, and they're both reflected by this first component.
Yeah. Wow.
All right. So let's move on, and then let's go to the second component. And of course, after there is a positive peak, there has to be a negative peak, right? And the second negative peak is the best name for it would be the N2, because it's also the second negative component, and it sometimes is referred to as the N2. However, when we're specifically talking about getting a reward or getting feedback, then it's called the feedback related negativity, or FRN, which is a little bit unfortunate because it would have been easier to just call it N2, but it's called FRN. I will just refer to it as the second negative peak so that we don't get confused. So what's that doing? Because you already have the information whether something is good or bad, right? So what's happening? Why does there need to be 3 more components, right? Well, actually, when I talked about the predictive coding, I told you that you will compare the actual reward you got to what you expected it to be, right? So if you expected during Christmas a present of $500 because you kind of knew that everybody would get present of $500, then that will be a worse than expected outcome, right? So there is a mismatch between what you thought would happen and what actually happened. Coming back to the example of the candy bar, if you bought that candy bar, you probably had the expectation that this will be a great tasting candy bar. However, when it then actually tastes like garbage, then there is a big mismatch between what you expected and what the actual outcome was. And that is really important. Why is that important? Because that tells us whether we should repeat this action or not, right? So if an outcome is better than expected, that's an outcome that we probably want to repeat in the future. Whereas if it's worse than expected, then you would probably want to avoid it. And if it's just a good action, then nothing needs to change, right? So if you're doing something and it always consistently gives you a good outcome, then yes, you don't have to change behavior. So you just keep repeating doing that. However, when something is better than expected, you want to do it more. And when something is worse than expected, you want to do it less. So that's kind of like the FRN, this second negative component, is really important to change behavior.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying, so with this example of a candy bar, when we first take a bite of this candy bar, we experience a reward because maybe it tastes good, right? So we experience and this can be measured with a P2 event-related potential in the brain. But then, of course, you also compare this reward that we have with our expectation. And if there's a mismatch, so if maybe we anticipated the candy bar to taste better than it did, then there's a mismatch, and that's where the FRN comes in.
Exactly. So what you will see is that this second negative component, the FRN, it will be bigger when there is this mismatch. So the bigger the mismatch, the bigger the second negative component will be. And so yeah, so then you would expect, okay, so you know whether it's a reward or punishment, you know how you feel about that reward and a punishment, and you know whether it's the same or different from what you expected. So that's it, right? So why are there two more components? Well, actually, that's because I said the FRN is important to change behavior, but it actually there's more to that. More is needed to actually change the behavior. And that's where the last two components come in, the P3, like the third positive component. And actually, you can divide them in two sections. And those two sections happen somewhat at overlapping times. They happen very close to each other time-wise, but you can see them at different parts of the brain. The first part of that P3 component, which is called the P3a, happens in the frontal part of the brain, whereas the second part is more at the back of the brain. But they happen kind of simultaneously. The P3b is a little bit later, but it's not, it's kind of simultaneous. So what do they reflect? And those are attention potential. So if you focus your attention on something, then you will see a P3 component. And you will see this also like in non-reward settings, right? So if you, for example, listen to a noise and all of a sudden that noise changes, then of course you will be like, oh, wait, that noise changed, right? And that is when you will always see a P3 component. So that's really an attention signal. When you have attention, you will see P3 100% all the time, something you can see in all participants in every research. So that's, again, something that's really, really clear in the brain. And that is really important when we're talking about wanting to change behavior based on rewards and punishments, because you can only change your behavior if you were made aware of that mismatch. For example, if we take a child to a doctor and the child needs to get a shot, right? A vaccine or something like that. Typically, what children will do is they will cry, right? Because it's not nice to get a shot. It hurts. It's just, if they get it in the arm, then the arm will hurt. They will experience pain, and of course, pain is a negative outcome. And such a negative outcome would, of course, induce a negative potential at the N2 level, right? At the second negative peak, there will be something, because, of course, typically we are expecting good outcomes, and then of course a negative outcome would always induce this negative peak. However, I don't know if you ever tried this, if you have children in the family, or if you have your own children, if you ever tried this, but if you redirect their attention, then it seems that the child doesn't even notice. So for example, a child gets shot, and then a nurse is there with holding a teddy bear and distracting its attention. The child will not even notice that it got the shot. So it won't notice the pain. It won't notice the negative outcome in this sense. And of course, when I'm talking about negative outcome, getting a vaccine or a shot is typically a good outcome. But of course, the child, in that moment doesn't realize that, right? It's just I'm really talking about that peak, that pain moment. But if you distract the attention, so you put the attention somewhere else, then that pain or that negative outcome isn't even felt. And that's an example of where there is a negative outcome, a mismatch between what you expected and what actually happened, but without attention. And of course, then you can ask yourself, well, if you didn't even notice the punishment, is there actual punishment, right? And and the same is true for rewards, right? If you're getting a better than expected outcome, but you don't notice it because you're not attending to it, then you won't experience it. So this attention component is also related to consciousness, right? So to conscious experience of the positive or negative outcome. And that is yeah, go ahead.
No, like I think that's a very cool question. I mean, if we don't notice the reward, or if we don't notice the punishment, is it a punishment? If a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, doesn't make a sound. Like.
Yes.
Yeah. That's
a completely different bombshell that I don't want to get into right now. But
true.
But yeah. So there are definitely things happening in the brain where the outcomes are processed, positive or negative, but we don't have a conscious experience of it. And this is where consciousness is really important, and is related to attention. And yeah, as I said, if something is positive or negative, but you don't experience it, is it then actually a reward or a punishment? And I would say probably not. But more importantly, if you don't notice it, you cannot learn from it, right? You cannot, if you don't notice that something was worse than expected, you won't change your behavior. For example, when you put your hand on a hot stove, you will immediately take your hand away because that's an instant punishment, right? But if you wouldn't be able to feel that is a punishment, then you probably wouldn't take away your hand. And there's actually an interesting. It's sad for the people who have it, but there's a disease called CIPA, C-I-P-A, I believe it's written, which is a disease where people don't experience pain, and they hurt themselves all the time because they cannot learn from negative outcomes because they don't experience the negative outcomes. In this case, that's more of a sensory disease, so it's not completely related to what I'm talking about here. But it does show you, if you're not aware of the negative outcomes, you cannot learn from them.
Right. So then this P3a is really then important for learning, right? Based on reward.
Well, yeah. So that's where those two P3 components come in, right? So the P3a is actually reflecting attention, whereas this P3b, which is seen at a somewhat different location at somewhat the same time, that's really for learning, or as we would call it in more technical terms, updating the prediction model. So kind of like you update what based on your previous knowledge. So if you have a candy bar that tastes great, you might buy again. If the candy bar was better than expected, you will probably buy a lot of them. And if it was worse than expected, you will update your model to never buy this thing again. And that's kind of like updating the prediction model is kind of what learning is, right? Or at least what learning based on reward and punishment is. Of course, there's different kinds of learning, right? If you learn vocabulary, you learn 10 words, that's not related to reward and punishment. But but yeah, that's so reward and punishment learning. That's kind of like updating the prediction model.
Mm-hmm.
So just in summary, if you look at it, when we're talking about getting a reward, there are like 4 steps in there that are all necessary for you to understand what a reward actually is. So for you to, at the point you bite into this candy bar, to actually understand what you experienced and whether you want to have that candy bar again, which is kind of what we think of if we colloquially talk about reward, that takes 4 steps. And we can see those 4 steps in the brain with EEG, and we can see them reliably, and we can see them in all participants.
Yeah, I mean, this is really cool stuff. I'm not gonna lie. I think this is really cool. But one thing I'm wondering is you kind of alluded to P3a and P3b happening in different parts of the brain. So I'm wondering just, so where does all this stuff happen in the brain, and how can we measure it? And also you kind of linked, or we talked about dopamine in the beginning of this podcast. So how is this all related?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's I kind of like went to a rant, or not a rant, but I kind of lost myself in my own story here, and I completely forgot about that. But yeah, so
Passion, man.
Yeah, well, I know. Thank you. Anyway, so yeah, we can locate where things happen in the brain. However, we cannot do this with this EEG method. This EEG method is very good at finding the different things that happen at different times, but it's not very good at finding where it actually happens.
Right.
So for that, you need other techniques, and I will say up front that I have not that much experience with that myself, but of course I read about it, and when I wrote down papers, I always had to write down where I expect this to happen. So there's a lot of research that has been done on this, and it's typically done with an MRI machine. And I guess most listeners will be aware of what an MRI machine is. For those who don't, it's that big tube thing you will sometimes see in a hospital, where you go lie in, and then they can make a scan of the inside of your body. And of course, when they can make a scan of the inside of your body, they can also make a scan of the inside of your brain. And actually, they have a specialized function in there, which is called functional magnetic resonance imaging, functional MRI, or fMRI. And that's when you can actually see the activity in the brain. And that is really good to distinguish where stuff happens. I say good, it's still limited, of course, because it would be better if we could just open up the skull, but we tend to not do this in alive human people. So, can't do that. But so what you basically will see is that there's an entire network of brain areas that are activated. So it's not one spot in the brain, it's not 2 spots in the brain. It's probably a collection of 20, 30 areas in the brain that are active. And that, they do relate to those EEG signals that we talked about before. So one area that you will see that is active is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the most frontal part of the brain, so it's actually above your eyes. And it's also a part of the brain that is kind of unique to humans. Although other animals have it, it's not as big as it is in our brain. And that is really related to cognition and understanding, and all the things that kind of make humans unique, but also understanding of rewards and punishments. So we're talking about the prefrontal cortex. So we're talking about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the orbital frontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex. I mean, those names, you don't need to know them at all, but those are just different areas in the frontal part of the brain that are all related. And for example, the orbitofrontal cortex, it's called orbitofrontal. The orbit is the eyes, right? And frontal is, well, that's still frontal. So it's basically the part of the brain that's actually behind the eyes. And that area is that is really related to subjective experience of reward. So remember when we talked about the P2 component that can distinguish between you getting the $100 presents and everybody around you getting the $500 presents. When you would do this and do an MRI scan of that or an fMRI scan of that, you will see that the orbitofrontal cortex will be active. And there are some studies that actually also link that this P2 component to orbitofrontal activity. So that's kind of what that area does. And the anterior cingulate cortex, which is a different part of the frontal part of the brain, is more related to more the objective kind of, is it positive, is it negative, and also is there a mismatch? So we know that, for example, the FRN component, this mismatch detector, whether the reward was as expected or better than expected or worse than expected, this is kind of located in the anterior cingulate cortex. Again, you don't have to memorize the names, but it's kind of cool to know that we can link those EEG components to actual brain scans. Even though I should say that those EEG components, they are typically spread out a little bit over multiple areas, and as I said, it's an all connected thing, and it's an entire network. But those would be the hotspots of those components. And but yeah, that's kind of the frontal part of the brain, and then there is also a deeper part of the brain, more in the middle of the brain, and that's where there are some areas that are also related to reward, and that's kind of where the initial reward processing starts. And again, I will call some names, and yeah, you don't have to memorize me. One you mentioned before is the substantia nigra. That's where dopamine receptors lie. So that's where dopamine is. I wouldn't say it's created, but that's a hotspot of dopamine. Another one is the ventral tegmental area. That's also a part of the brain which is really strongly dominated by dopamine receptors. And the nucleus accumbens, and they also connect to the amygdala. The amygdala is maybe a little bit more known to people because that's an area that is important for emotion, particularly fear, but also positive emotions. So, of course, when you get a reward, that's typically linked to a positive emotion, right? It's not like you get a reward and then start crying because you're so sad. So that's right. Kind of related to that as well. Because I mean, imagine that the amygdala wouldn't be in there, so you would get a reward, and you would like, okay, cool, I got a reward. Okay, cool, I got a punishment. Like you wouldn't, that would be interesting. But yeah, and so those deeper areas are connected to the frontal part of the areas. And as I said, those deeper areas, that's where kind of the dopamine is. That's kind of where dopamine projections are towards the frontal cortex.
Wow, yeah. So I mean, this sounds a bit, complicated. I mean, as you describe it, this isn't, our processing of rewards is not happening in one single place of the brain. It's a whole, combination of it's a network of different structures, both in kind of deeper brain structures, but also in the front. And yeah, I mean, this is a bit complicated, but it's really cool,
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I understand that it's of course complicated, particularly when I'm throwing out those names of those areas. But those really don't really matter. So the important thing to get from this is that we have those 4 components that really connect to 4 different aspects of the predictive coding, and then those components, particularly the early components like the subjective versus objective reward, and also the mismatch detection. That's where kind of dopamine is playing an important role. So yeah, I mean, we can talk a little bit more about dopamine. It's not my main topic of interest, but it's definitely cool, and that's the thing that most people have heard about. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So dopamine. Yeah, well, what is dopamine? So first of all, dopamine, people refer to it as a chemical in the brain, and that is technically correct. Actually, it is like not even technically; it's fully correct, but what it actually is a neurotransmitter, and a neurotransmitter is neurotransmitters are used for the communication between brain cells. So when one brain cell connects to another, they send a signal, and to actually go from one neuron to another, that open space in between has to be covered by some chemicals that go from one to the other, and those chemicals are called neurotransmitters. And this was very simplified because there are actual research lines that look for this for 50, 100 years only on this specific part from going one neuron to another and neurotransmitters. So that was very simplified within like 30 seconds. But yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. And dopamine is one of those neurotransmitters.
Chemical messengers or whatever you want to call them.
Exactly, yes. And what we will see is that different areas in the brain will be dominated by different kind of neurotransmitters. So as I said, those the ones in the middle of the brain, this ventral tegmental area and the substantia nigra, that's where a lot of dopamine is going on. It's not only dopamine, but that's where the hotspot is. And there are other areas of brain where other neurotransmitters are important. Anyway, so a lot of study has been done on when dopamine is actually released into the brain. And something that, and this is also where we can start talking about addiction, because of course, when we're talking about this kind of stuff, addiction is something that can happen. I mean, we talked about it before, right? If that bag of cookies goes open, it has to go away, right? So like that's not going to survive.
Right.
Yeah, and so addiction, and of course that's not addiction. That's just not being able to control yourself. But of course it's related, right? So it's kind of it's like a mini version of addiction. So let's talk about how dopamine looks like in relation to getting rewards and how this can relate to addiction. First of all, we need to talk about primary and secondary rewards.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard of that, Michael? What primary and secondary rewards are?
Yes, I have, and correct me if I'm wrong. I'll give a brief. I'll explain my brief understanding of it. So, primary rewards are biological rewards, right? So it refers to rewards that are necessary for our survival, correct?
Exactly. Yes. In a nutshell, you could say food and sex. It's as simple as that. Food and sex. That's our primary things for survival. And when I'm talking about food, I'm talking again about sugar, about fat, and about salt, because those are the things that back in the days of our ancestors were most important for their survival. You need fat to isolate yourself, to get some fat so that you don't starve in the cold. You need sugar for energy, and you need salt for other stuff in the body that I don't really know, but you need salt. Let's just say you need salt. And that's why we so strongly like those ones, right? That's why we like sugar so much. That's why we like salt so much. And that's why we like fatty food so much, because they are extremely important for our survival. Well, maybe not in the 21st century, and maybe also not in the second part of the 20th century, but in all the centuries before, we needed this kind of stuff to survive, because otherwise we would starve. And then, of course, the other one is sex, which is, compared to food, is not something you need on a daily basis, but still it is something that will always give us a reward no matter what we're doing. Well, maybe not always, but, a lot of times. And then there are secondary rewards. Those are rewards that are not directly related to our survival, but still eventually can lead to better survival and are just giving us pleasure, basically. So, for example, listening to some nice music will give us a good feeling. Having social interactions, although you could argue that it's maybe even a primary one. All this kind of stuff, looking at art, enjoying the sunny weather, you name it. Everything that gives you pleasure, but is not directly related to your survival. That's a secondary reward. And then there is one interesting one. That's money. Money is is technically a secondary reward, because what is money? Money is just a piece of paper or just a number on your bank account, right? It's not something that promotes your survival. But you can buy stuff that promote your survival, aka food. And also, nowadays, money is so intertwined with our lives. It's so important in our lives that for a lot of people, just having money is very, very important and will give a very strong response in the brain. So that's kind of like a pseudo primary reward. But yeah, it technically is a secondary reward. So why am I mentioning this? Why am I mentioning primary versus secondary rewards? The reason for that is that the primary rewards are the ones you don't really habituate to. What does habituate mean? Habituate means that you get used to it, basically. Or that means that the signal becomes lower over time. And primary rewards, you don't habituate very well to them, which means you always want more of that. Coming back to sugar, salt, and fatty foods, you always want more of those. Why? Because they're so important for your survival. And as I said, back in our ancestry days, there was almost no such thing as having too much of those, because there would always be scarcity, right? So you don't get used to them. You always want more. These will always be rewards. Whereas the secondary rewards, you habituate to them a lot quicker. For example, if you listen to a nice song on the radio, you will enjoy that. But if it's repeated for a second time immediately afterwards, you might enjoy it less. And then if you hear it for 50 times in a row, then you definitely want to hear something different. So secondary rewards are the ones that you habituate to a lot quicker. And those are definitely not, I'm saying definitely not, which I probably shouldn't say, but they're not so linked to addiction at all, right? You cannot get to something addicted if you don't want more of it because you habituate to it. That just is a contradiction in itself.
Right.
So the primary rewards, as I said, those are the ones that you always want more of. You want more sex, you want more sugar, you want more salt, you want more fat. And that kind of sounds like an addiction, right? That's kind of,
I need my sugar, man.
Yes, exactly. And that's why some people say that sugar is addictive. And in this sense, this kind of is true, right? So what does it look like in the brain? Because we're kind of talking about the brain, right? So there are some interesting studies done in the last century in animals where they actually recorded the neurons that respond to dopamine or where dopamine is released. And so this can only be done by actually implanting an electrode into the brain. That's why it's done in animals. And of course, we can discuss whether that is ethically okay or not. But last century, nobody batted an eye on that. So let's just, we have the research, so let's go with it. So what you will see is that for a lot of dopamine neurons or neurons that respond to dopamine, they will have a dopamine response when they get a reward. So in the case of a monkey, they typically get a juice that they like. And when they get the juice, you will see that those neurons become active. So there's a spike in dopamine-related neurons activity. However, if you keep repeating that reward, and this is more true for secondary rewards, then you will see that the dopamine response is becoming less and less and less. So that's kind of what the habituation is, right? The thing that is rewarding becomes less rewarding, and that's why you don't want more and more of it. So that's why it's sometimes interesting if some people talk, okay, yeah, I'm going to the gym, and then you get a dopamine release. Well, if you're going to the gym for 2 years in a row, then I'm not sure if that dopamine release is still very big. It's probably something else that motivates you to go there, the long-term goal, but it's not the dopamine itself. That's why I find it interesting that you hear particularly fitness channels sometimes talk about dopamine, and it's probably not even correct. But okay, that's a side story. Anyway, so however, of course, when you then do not give this reward for quite a while, that dopamine response does return, right? So if you give the monkey juice, then that dopamine response to juice will become less and less and less. But if you then don't give it juice for a week or maybe even a day, then the dopamine response will be as big as before. So this habituation is not lasting. It just goes down and then comes back. But yeah, for the primary rewards, this habituation is a lot slower and in some cases even non-existent. And that's what we talked about with the addiction. So is sugar an addiction? Michael, tell me.
I mean, at first glance, I mean, the answer would be yes, right?
Right.
However,
However, yes, exactly. It's as it always is in the brain. It's more complex than that, because what actually is an addiction? What's the definition of an addiction? And that's where we get a problem, because there is no set in stone definition of what an addiction is. If you define an addiction of a state where you want more and more and more, which is more like a psychological description of what it is, then yes, you could define sugar or salt as an addiction. However, when we actually look at addictive drugs, and particularly opiates, such as morphine or painkillers, or I mean, it's even true for cigarettes, right?
Nicotine, man.
There's something else going on, right? Because if you compare those two, so the opiates to let's pick one. Let's pick heroin and compare it to sugar, because I've seen that in an article before where they said like, yeah, sugar is the new heroin. Okay, whatever. So, but that's an unfair comparison, because sugar acts on the dopamine system. Heroin does too, but heroin also affects the noradrenaline system directly. So basically, heroin directly affects neurons in the noradrenaline system. So I mentioned a difficult word there, noradrenaline. Okay, what is that? Adrenaline, people have heard of, and noradrenaline is a version of that. Well, it's not a version of that, but it's related to that. Let's say it like that. Sometimes it's also called epinephrine. It's the same thing. It's just another difficult word. It's the same thing. Noradrenaline. So noradrenaline, just as dopamine, is a neurotransmitter. So there are neurons in the brain that are particularly responsive to getting signals from noradrenaline. And noradrenaline, and that's why I say it's related to adrenaline itself, which people have heard of, is important for arousal. So how aroused you are, so it's also related to sleep, calmness, blood pressure, heart rate. That's all that all those things are controlled by noradrenaline. And that's why when you and of course the opiates, they affect that system directly, which means if you don't get opiates, let's say heroin, then you will have withdrawal symptoms. And those withdrawal symptoms will be, and you guessed it, a lack of sleep, a lack of rest, an itchy feeling, this feeling of agitation, which is all related to the noradrenaline system. And this is something that doesn't happen with sugar. I'm saying it doesn't happen. That's not true, because some people will feel some withdrawal symptoms of sugar. Actually, it's more craving. Craving and withdrawal systems are not the same thing. You can crave something, which really means you're missing it. You want it very much. And you might even have a bodily reaction to missing it, like being a little bit agitated or something like that. But it's not the same as withdrawal symptoms. Withdrawal symptoms are basically is a very strong form of craving. Okay, so what's happening in the brain? So I talked about the dopamine system, the noradrenaline system. Heroin directly affects the noradrenaline system. Sugar does not. Sugar only affects the dopamine system. However, why then does a lack of sugar create sometimes this agitated feeling, particularly in people who like there are of course differences between people. Like for example, people who have diabetes tend to like sugar a little bit more, and they also show stronger cravings when they don't get it. When they don't get it really sounds like an addiction now, right? That's not what I meant. But you know, there is some stronger craving going on there. And I don't want to generalize for everybody, but that seems to be the case if you ask most of them. And that's because the dopamine and the noradrenaline system in the brain itself are already connected. So if you get a dopamine-related reward, that will decrease activity in the noradrenaline system. That's why when you eat sugar or anything else that's rewarding, you become a little bit relaxed, you come a little bit slower. And also if you have a high sugary meal, you will sometimes experience an after dinner dip, which is basically just your dopamine system telling you that you are very happy at this point, and then it just connects to this, or it is connected to the noradrenaline system, and kind of like, okay, he can relax now, he can chill out, decrease heart rate, decrease blood pressure. Well, not decrease blood pressure, that's not true, but relax a little bit. So in the brain itself, dopamine and noradrenaline are connected, which means that if you get a dopamine related reward, this will have an indirect effect on the noradrenaline system itself. So what does that mean? Okay. Basically, when you get heroin or another opiate, this will have a direct effect on dopamine, and it will have a direct effect on noradrenaline. When you eat sugar, it will have a direct effect on the dopamine. It will not have a direct effect on the noradrenaline system, but it will have an indirect effect because the dopamine and noradrenaline system are already connected to each other. Which means that if you look at, if you take those two things, it should affect the dopamine and it should affect the noradrenaline system as the two criteria for what an addiction is, then sugar will check kind of 1.5 of those boxes. Like the first one, it definitely does. And the second, kind of, because it's an indirect effect, but not really. So it really depends on where you draw the line and when you say something is an addiction or not. And currently there is no consensus on that.
And I guess the same thing also goes for the symptoms that you experience yourself. I mean, as you alluded to earlier, I mean, you can have a really, really strong craving for sugar, and that can lead to even some bodily symptoms that are very similar to addiction, right? So that kind of clouds the addiction as well.
Right, and it's particularly when people are agitated. So it goes in two directions, right? So when are people craving sugar? Typically, when they had a bad day, right? So when you feel like shit, when your noradrenaline system, when you're stressed out, when the noradrenaline system is very active, you kind of want to slow that down. And how can you do it? By getting a reward and by activating the dopamine system, because that in turn will lower down that agitation created by the noradrenaline system. So yeah, that's definitely what's happening. Is it an addiction or not? I would still tend to say probably sugar is not an addiction, but it is definitely something we should be aware of. How it works and like, even if we don't call it an addiction, we of course still should be watching out with how much we eat of it, and we should be responsible with it.
Right.
But yeah, coming back to what you said, yeah, when the box of cookies goes open, it has to disappear. That's definitely also related to this habituation thing, right? You don't habituate, so it has to go.
Right. Oh, wow. But yeah, I mean, this is really cool. I mean, I mean, the relationship between, the ERP components and reward and addiction, I mean, it's all, there's so many pieces of the puzzle that are connected. And yeah, I mean, this is really cool stuff.
Yeah. So when people talking about rewards, just as simple as seeing points on a screen, or just as simple as taking that bite of that candy bar, a lot of stuff is going on in the brain, and it's actually quite complex. And so if people talk about, you get a reward, then your dopamine system gets active, yes, that is true, but if you go in more detail, you can talk about it for more than an hour, I guess. So,
Right.
so you know, it's complex stuff, but it's cool. And to be fair, I now told you maybe 10% of the story, maybe 5% of the story. There's so much more you could get into. And even in my own research, I have looked at different aspects of this, where we didn't talk about individual differences. We didn't talk about what happens if you get additional information about a reward. So, for example, if you make a prediction of the reward, but can you make this prediction better when you get additional information? For example, if an expert tells you, okay, this is going to lead to a reward, how is that affecting your prediction of whether you get a reward or not? So there is all kinds of stuff that we didn't touch upon, and we probably will in the future podcast. But yeah, I guess for now, I will shut up.
No, I mean, I really enjoyed sitting back and listening. I mean, some of the things that you mentioned are things that I've learned myself in the past in my studies, but it's always nice to have a clear kind of coherence through it, right? And yeah, I think you explained things very well, and
well, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you
like
have
you
me
too.
listening.
I like
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I guess that's it. Yeah, to all the listeners, if you're still around, thank you a lot for listening to it. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, or you, of course, can contact us directly. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, that's it from my part. Maybe you can have some last words.
Yeah, so stay psyched, people, and we'll see you next video.
All right. Bye-bye.
Peace.